Hello, greetings from ICMR National Institute of Epidemiology. Welcome to the online e-certificate course, Causal Inference from Observational Studies, abbreviated as CAUSAL. And I'll be going through this topic, Overview of Epidemiologic Study Designs. This topic is divided into two sessions, each session approximately 10 minutes. The first is Classification of Epidemiologic Study Designs, and second is Ecologic Studies. In the session before this, we discussed classification of epidemiologic study designs. Now, we will discuss ecologic studies. Before we proceed with discussion on ecologic studies, let us try and understand the two words that I'll be commonly using in this session: exposure and outcome. We discussed this in our previous session as well, but it is important that we discuss it again for this session. Exposure variable is also called as independent variable, in common jargon, cause. Outcome variable is also called as dependent variable, and in common jargon, we refer to it as effect. Some examples of exposure variable are drug and smoking, and the corresponding outcome variables are cure, adverse effect, prevention of disease, and lung cancer. Another example of exposure variable is family history of smoking, and the corresponding outcome variable is current smoking status. Vaccination could also be an exposure variable with the corresponding outcome variable as incidence of disease. Please note 2 points. That an exposure variable could be a risk factor or it could be a preventive factor. Also note that a particular variable can be both an exposure variable or an outcome variable. For example, when we look at smoking and lung cancer, smoking is an exposure variable. When we look at family history of smoking and current smoking status is an outcome variable. It is important that we understand exposure and outcome variable. Understanding of this is essential before we classify epidemiologic study designs. In the previous session, we had discussed this classification of epidemiologic study design. However, please note that this classification is applicable to quantitative studies, where individual is the unit of observation. In qualitative studies and mixed method studies, the classification is separate. Similarly, if the unit of observation is not an individual but a population, then we do not use this classification of epidemiologic study designs. This is where we have ecologic studies. Please note, these are not studies of ecosystems. Here, units of observations are populations rather than individuals. These are correlational studies using aggregate measures of the populations. Let me give you 2 examples. Proportion consuming alcohol and suicide rates. If you look at them by country, we want to see whether by country the suicide rates increase by change in proportion consuming alcohol. Similarly, dietary fat intake and breast cancer by country. We want to see whether those countries with higher dietary fat intake have higher rates of breast cancer or otherwise. This diagram shows the relationship between rate of dental caries in children's permanent teeth and fluoride content of public water supply. In y-axis, we have the dental caries experience in the permanent teeth per 100 children examined. In y-axis, we have the fluoride content of public water supply. We see a downward trend. That is, as the fluoride content of public water supply increases, the dental caries experience per 100 children examined reduces. In other words, areas with high fluoride content of public water supply have lower dental caries, and areas with lower fluoride content of public water supply have higher dental caries experience. However, please note that there is something called as ecological fallacy in ecologic studies. This means association at population level does not necessarily mean association at individual level. In other words, what we infer at population level may not necessarily be true at individual level. However, ecologic studies are very useful to generate hypotheses. Whatever hypotheses are generated in ecologic studies may be tested in individual level observational studies. We discussed these individual level observational studies in our previous session. Thank you.